Yes, there we go. Okay, so happy to introduce you to our last panel of investors. There's various perspectives represented here, from consultants and OCIOs to asset managers. And we're going to go through a lot of the things we talked about this morning about options, but really their job is to give you some real action items that you can take when you go back, because the next thing you're going to be doing is writing that letter to yourself and figuring out what actions you're going to take when you get back to your campus. So with no further ado, thank you guys.
Hello. So I'm Meredith Heimburger, and Kelly and I were talking over lunch about how all of the previous panelists either set us up for success or stole our thunder, and we're not sure which. So I was taking notes furiously, changing what we were going to say to try to better reflect a conversation that hasn't already been covered. So apologies in advance. Hope this goes okay. But I did want to start with a few points that just frame the conversation based on my perspective. And so, you know, I think, first of all, when we talk about moving to implementation from the policy perspective, many of you are here, and I am here because of my values and my philosophy and my perspective on how we should be investing. But the reality is philosophical conversations are very difficult at the trustee level. And when you're sitting around a table, it's almost impossible to get a group of people to all agree on the same set of values, on the exact same philosophy. It's actually not that hard to get everyone to agree on the same action steps and say, what do we own today? What do we want to do about it? And can we agree on that decision? And so I would start by saying, you know, I recommend across the board as you're entering these conversations when you go home, that you really start from a place of what is actionable, what do we actually own today, how do we address that, rather than trying to get everyone to agree philosophically. So the four of us are going to share with you all some tangible examples from investment portfolios of sort of how we can start to address the issues rather than a philosophical one. Second, I think it's really important that people know what they own in an actionable way. So knowing exactly what's in your portfolio in a way that speaks to your values and in a way that relates to actions that you can take is very important. And with apologies to the asset managers in the room, I think we need to get a lot more comfortable sharing a lot more information with clients. I think that the investment industry has for a very long time said, what's the least amount of information I can share and not lose a client? And I think we need to reframe that as what's the most information I can share so that my clients can make important decisions without threatening the opportunity set in the market. And so we will talk a little bit about that as well. So I want to start with the real world examples and what we have in our portfolios today. And Sasha, specifically, your team makes climate focused investments. Can you just talk a little bit about sort of what you're seeing in the landscape in terms of challenges and then some real world examples of how you're investing to combat climate issues?
Sure. So, you know, the first thing I would say about climate is it's such a big topic, right? So we've coming from an environmental background, you can think about other environmental issues like we talked about in previous conversations, the hole in the ozone layer. And that seemed like a big deal and it was very scary. But in reality, this is a single point. It's an easy problem to understand. What are the inputs? What's happening that we don't want? And then let's deal with the inputs. We talk about climate. We're talking about inputs that are coming from all of the largest industries that underpin the way that we live our lives. How we grow our food, how we transport ourselves and our goods, how we manufacture everything, the buildings we live in, the energy we produce. All of these industries, not in a superficial way, but in a fundamental way, create drivers for climate change. And so when we talk about this as an investment opportunity, it's really a broad scope that we take from an industry perspective. We can't be too narrow or else we're missing some component of this. The flip side of that is that the impact is also incredibly diffuse. So it's part of why it's difficult to tackle, because on a personal perspective, it's very hard to see on a day-to-day basis how climate change is impacting my life. I still get up at the same time and I still go to the store. And so at the industry level, though, the impacts are starting to be felt in a real way. So resource constraint and pricing, predictability, flooding. I mean, there's a plethora of impacts that the industries are feeling. And the way that we look at the world, and I think that increasingly others will begin to see this who haven't been digging around environmental issues as long as we have, is that these are really driving the largest industrial transformations of our time. So we think that there's an industrial revolution happening. We can see it in some of the large scale statistics. So renewable energy is now less expensive than conventional fossil fuel generation in many states. And I think the predictions are something like 2030, the OPEX, so the operating expense of a coal plant, is going to be more than the CapEx of building renewable generation. That is a tremendous shift in how we generate energy and the cost of doing so and how we do so. Similarly, most car companies on that same timeline think they're going to be producing a majority electric vehicles. So the largest industries are in this process of transformation. On the one hand, that may be scary because that's a big source of risk for a lot of portfolios. If you're sitting in our shoes and investing in solutions, it's a huge opportunity. And we don't have to depend on people doing things out of the goodness of their hearts. To Meredith's point, I think a lot of us come to this from a perspective of kind of personal values and how do we leverage a system to create change. But we don't have to worry about people doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. Major industries, the incumbent industries, need to make these changes. And so where EIF invests is in the kind of young companies that have market-ready solutions. So we're not doing speculative technology bets. We're also not doing project finance. But what are the market-ready solutions for addressing some of these problems as they become tangible to the incumbent? So what does that mean? To just pick a few tangible examples and I think hopefully showcase the diversity of what that means. On the mitigation side, more renewable generation versus fossil fuel generation is better. So we've invested in pick and shovel plays like racking solutions so that getting solar up on a roof is less expensive and quicker than it otherwise would be. Similarly, build out of EV charging networks. So there can be more EV vehicles. And I think one kind of interesting thought exercise around kind of the way that this is promoting change, we not only see car companies shifting to EV production, but there's a fight going on now between the fossil fuel companies and the electric utilities for who's going to become the fueling infrastructure of the future. There's an opportunity now for that to shift entirely. So that's been a really interesting thing that's driving a lot of acquisition interest for those kind of companies in our portfolio. Then as we start seeing more distributed renewables, more EVs, then there's a need for second order solutions like can you build software to integrate all of these distributed assets into the grid, and the utilities now are able to rate base them. So they're saying, gee, maybe we should own these instead of letting our customers acquire renewables and an EV, and then they're probably gonna buy a battery and they don't need us anymore. And so the utilities are now interested in being the owners, and so we also have an investment in a company that provides software so that the utilities can control all of these assets and provide grid services like voltage and frequency regulation in addition to load balancing and a whole bunch of other good stuff. Other end of the spectrum, we have plays around resiliency, because the reality is that the impacts of climate change are already happening and they're not particularly well understood. And even if we were magically able to pull back drastically from where we are today on a carbon emission perspective, they're going to keep going. So we have a smart stormwater infrastructure company, so making better use of existing assets because it's incredibly expensive and impractical in many places to add stormwater capacity. So how can you take an existing stormwater basin and get more effective capacity out of it? Well, if you take some intelligent software brains and some off-the-shelf hardware, you can make sure that your basin is emptied out before a major storm event, or that you're letting solids settle out if you're worried about pollution and the like. That's a company called Aduke that does that. So I feel like I've been talking for a long time.
No, it's great. Those are real examples.
There's real examples. More,
That's
I
how you
can keep
do
going
it.
with examples. I'll do one more.
We're
So on
done.
the existing asset front, I think mitigation and resiliency often there are a lot of places where that overlaps, and I think this concept that we're going to be able to just build on new stuff and we're going to have breakthrough inventions that solve all this for us is not realistic with how the world works and how long it takes for systems to change. So we try to be really practical, not only about making existing assets handle the forces of climate change better, but then also using them to incrementally improve mitigation. So another investment we have is a company called Bluon, which has a refrigerant that not only is low global warming potential, which is what everyone pays attention to, but the thing that is not discussed and is a huge issue is that there's usually a trade-off between the global warming potential, so what the actual refrigerant emissions does, with how efficient the equipment is. So if your refrigerant is actually making your equipment less efficient, that's about a 10x impact on the refrigerant itself. It's a really big deal, and it's totally misunderstood, I think, across the board. So this is the company that's developed a novel refrigerant that improves the efficiency of existing HVAC infrastructure, so not requiring people to go out and get entirely new HVAC equipment. and improves the efficiency in addition to having a low global warming potential. So there's a ton of interesting opportunities, and hopefully I'll give someone else a chance to talk, but they really do cross every single industry, the way we live, the way we produce things, the way we operate. And it's exciting because there are tremendous financial opportunities.
So I think what Sasha said feeds well into my question for Jochebed, which is, a lot of fiduciaries do not have the level of expertise you have, cannot look at climate change and speak to specific investment examples. But what are the questions that fiduciaries should be asking, and how should they be asking those questions of their investment managers to make sure that they're getting the optimal outcomes from both a risk and an opportunity perspective?
Yeah, I think it starts with just knowing what you own and asking who's represented in the portfolio and what the process is by which you come to these managers, and whether there are policies and considerations around climate, but also around people. So the environment ultimately is going to impact people. So are you thinking about the communities that are represented in your portfolio and the companies that you own and how they impact the communities that they operate in? So just asking what is the process and where does the portfolio sit today? And then really pushing consultants on what their process is, what their policies are, and then asking for data as well. Just reporting data on these policies, and then also on the makeup of the companies that you're investing in, and whether they're paying people equitably, and whether they have any kind of community engagement process. So honestly, it really just starts with asking a lot of questions, understanding what you own, and then from there, where do you want to move in terms of aligning that with your values?
Thank you. And Kelly, can you help us think through the relationship then between measurement and knowing what you own, and then how you take action steps with what you learn from the measurement piece?
Right. So Jeff talked about earlier, what gets measured gets managed. And I love that phrase because no matter where you are in the process, if you're measuring something, it gives higher visibility. So to Jochebed's point, understanding what's in your portfolio and what its financial return expectations are is a pretty standard process, right? In an endowment, that's typically what you do. There's no difference in that and an impact or a mission or values aligned strategy. The problem is disclosure and data. So you have to push your consultants, eventually consultants and others, to help you surface the data, either at the manager level, so having the consultants press the managers to produce the data and evaluate the data with you, or starting to roll things up at the portfolio level, which is an interesting perspective to understand the intended and unintended consequences of how it all adds up. We do it from a financial perspective, and I mean, the examples that Sasha talked about are very critical, right? There are some practical things in some of those examples that you described. How it all rolls up to whatever the stated mission goal is a really important thing to start to look at. Now, the reality of it is measurement systems are in their infancy, in my opinion. Our firm has dumped a ton of money into this. Others have dumped a ton of money into this trying to measure. But the more clients start to say, we have to measure this, what are you doing about that? The more the consulting community and the asset management community will have to say, this is what we're doing. It's imperfect, right? And there is more art to it than science. I heard somebody say today, I don't think they're still in the room, but it's more art than science. But it's necessary to start, right? Disclosure and data is critical. And even if it's anecdotal examples that are starting your process to connect with trustees about what's happening, you have to find ways to measure. Understanding what you own and understanding what's happening inside the portfolios, I think, will really put a different lens and perspective about what's doing. And asset owners have to push us.
Yeah, I gave an impassioned plea on our prep call about sort of the role of transparency in portfolios. I came from the nonprofit world where if you have the answer, you tell everyone, and I was very confused by all these meetings where we would talk about, well, we think we figured it out, so don't tell anyone. It's this big secret. We know how to save the world, but we're not gonna tell anyone. And it is infuriating. And I think there's probably someone at the firms where you all are working with or who you're talking to, there's probably someone that wants to share that information, that wants to help you make these kinds of decisions.
Absolutely.
Empower them to do that. Ask the questions. Push them to give you answers. They can do it. And if they can't, there's now other opportunities. Leave. But there are better options than this sort of echo chamber where no one's going to share anything because it's a big secret to making more money. I think, one thing that we've been talking about are in different areas, there's certainly different approaches to all of this, and there are real implementation challenges. And I think people can get stuck. I've been with my firm for 8 years. I spent the first 4 years just going to conferences to learn, and we weren't investing a single dollar in this direction. And it was very intimidating to listen to panels and think, where do these people start? Like, how do you just dive in and do something and start measuring it? And so I want to speak a little bit, and I'll share a bit from my perspective, but then hear from you all. What's the biggest implementation challenge in your area? And how do you put one foot in front of the other and keep moving forward and make it happen? And I think for us, it was two things. One is client demand is really important, listening to your clients. And so for you all in the room who are those clients, speaking up when you want something is one way to get it done. And the other is one of those clients, in my case, has actually their founder had made a statement around sort of not letting perfect be the enemy of good. And it unleashed our team to say, well, we also cannot let perfect be the enemy of good. We have to start somewhere. We have to start measuring something. We have to start providing more information and being more transparent and taking more action. And so I think I would just say, for those of you who are at the beginning of your journey or you're particularly stuck on an issue, do the next thing that you can, whatever that next question is that you can ask or the next investment example that you can bring to a committee meeting to keep moving the process forward and keep building momentum.
Yeah, it's not lost on me that we're the implementation panel and that we're women because women gets things done. So I didn't say that men don't get things done. It's your interpretation of my statement, but women get things done. But one of the barriers to implementation is getting stuck, not having a first step. And so earlier in the other panels and across the roadmap that we've described, the first step is the hardest and getting past the first step. So, part of what we have tried to do is to create a practical first step to get kind of the watershed moving. So, given whatever a client's objective is, it's our job to try to provide what is implementable given the mission objective, right, in today's investment environment. And that's gotten infinitely better than 2 years ago, and it'll be infinitely better than 2 years from now. And so then what can happen? And there are a lot of different examples that we've heard, and in our practice, we've seen all of it. Carve-outs, trying to go 100% across the board, using private equity as a catalytic opportunity first, or the complete opposite, using public equities as the first baby step, right? To use traditional asset classes that are easily reportable, large cap growth, what's Coke and some other, Amazon or whatever, what are they doing because it's easily measurable, or going places where you think there are opportunities to really make this financial return and it's not a crowded field. So we've gotten stuck and tried to help clients get unstuck on step one. Because once you get past that one, it's interesting, I remember Libby's talk last year, right? And she was like, we're just thinking about this. And if you can imagine the difference between what she talked about up here last year and where she is right now, it's been light years because they took the first step and then all of a sudden, all the other steps started happening. Is that a fair, kind of fair? Kind of fair.
Mostly fair.
It sounded like it to me. It was like watershed, like, oh my God, they made a ton of progress in a year. So the barrier to me is the first step.
So it's interesting. I said I have a slightly different perspective, being kind of on the ground doing this. And it feels like an interesting moment in time where there's all of a sudden, and it's kind of all of a sudden, it's kind of not all of a sudden, but it's kind of all of a sudden that there's now not just interest and kind of poking around, but there are a lot of folks now who have mandates to do this, who are really trying to put capital to work. And it's very exciting as someone who's been doing basically the same thing for 15 years and, hoping that the world would wake up and see that, this is not just the right thing to do, but it's a really good thing to do financially. We have an excellent track record. We measure ourselves against other venture funds, not against other impact funds. And that it feels like the balance is starting to shift. I think, that point has been important to the way we've approached this. So as I said, I have an environmental background. I'm an engineer by training, and then went almost immediately into finance because I realized that was a much quicker way to get people to care about something. And my partners are all similar. We all have deep sustainability backgrounds and now investing backgrounds. And it has been the way that we've looked at the world, and I'm sort of curious if this resonates, and I think it does, is we can't rely on we have to measure what we do on the impact side, but a double bottom line approach is problematic in a variety of ways. We have to validate that there are opportunities that we're looking at that are just as exciting, if not more exciting, because the world is changing in this direction. And so if we can build a track record that illustrates that this is not, you're not trading off. You're not giving something back so you can do the right thing. You can make excellent returns for our asset class simply because we are specialists in what we do. We are really good at it, and our job is to make you money and to compete with every other venture fund out there, and we've done that. That makes the decision a lot easier than asking somebody to trade off doing the right thing for making a financial return. And so that has been our credo that we've lived by. And it's in a way because we're true believers and it's so important to us that this works. Talking about climate can often be a very pessimistic and upsetting discussion. But I feel very optimistic in that way, that it does feel like there is now a receptivity and a need for what we do in a way that there wasn't even 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to get stuck on what value to optimize for, especially traditional investors who are used to just optimizing for profit, and then starting to have to think about things that aren't just standard deviation and IRR and return. So one thing that I've found to be helpful is thinking about the macroeconomy and how you're positioning the portfolio for the future macroeconomy and for its long-term health, and thinking about how climate is going to impact different industries, how it's going to impact the health of the consumer, how it's going to just affect the context of what you're actually going to be investing in. And then that is something that's, I think, a lot easier to handle and to think about as a long-term investor with a perpetual time horizon, thinking about what is the macroeconomy going to look like in 10 years, and is my portfolio today positioned to take advantage of that?
Yeah. I think I'm supposed to take questions, but I don't have to. We can keep talking if you want. Y'all tell me what to do.
Where are we? You can keep talking for a minute.
Right, where are we? What's happening?
You're actually 1 minute early if you wanted to.
I can add one more thought.
Please,
So the comment about not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. I think, we know we have a pretty diverse set of LPs, and that set is probably expanding. And we know that we can't be everything to everyone. And we try to just be really true to what we do, and hopefully that fits. And that we see folks who really, they're single issue. They just care about water issues. Right. And so some of those will say, you're too broad. Some of those will invest in us, and we will do a lot of proactive deal sharing with them. We will talk to them about the things we're seeing in water and try to be a value-added partner to them in that way. But we know we're never going to be an all-water fund. And similarly, we have folks who say, you know what, you do basically green stuff, and that's cool, and so great. And so bringing that back to the kind of reporting conversation is, we did resist reporting on impact for the beginning of our life, because we felt like people were looking for a very narrow and overly simplistic kind of analysis of tell us in a number what you do. And when we're talking about comparing reducing microfiber pollution in the ocean with taking fossil fuels off the grid with, improving grid resiliency, it's difficult.
Right.
It's difficult. And so, but where we've ended up, because we know we have to do the storytelling and we know we're not going to be everything to everyone, but we have a diverse audience, we want to satisfy as much of that as possible, is we've ended up reporting more. And so we don't just put out kind of a number. We write an impact report every year, and that has both quantitative and qualitative data to do some of the storytelling behind, we're looking for systemic change. How does this thing, yes, we can count the number of, vehicles switched over or beverages switched from corn syrup to non-GMO pesticide-laden corn syrup-based stuff.
Right.
But what does that mean? Why are we doing it? What's the systemic change we're trying to drive? And so we end up from saying, we don't want to report because we think we're being oversimplified to, we now have like a 30-page report that we put out every year to combine the storytelling and the quantitative analysis and try to be true to who we are and communicate to our audience and, fit into the world however we can as transparently as possible.
Right, yeah. So I was just going to add this issue about how we're reporting from an impact perspective. If you're reporting well from a financial perspective, you're not just reporting a number either. Mm-hmm. The thing is that historically, some financial reporting really has just evolved down to, I'm reporting a number. Yep. Your fourth quarter performance was X, and it was X percentage on a relative basis over your benchmark. If you're reporting and understanding what that means to the client, what does that mean? So what? So what if you were 10 bips up, connected to what? Your endowment goals, the spending policy? I mean, there should be a way in the way you're reporting the financial performance that doesn't make the impact performance seem like such a big leap of something much more complex, but not every consultant is operating in that way from a financial perspective, and so there are varying gaps in terms of getting from what has typically been a financial performance report to an overall performance report. But I would posit that you want a more robust report no matter what you're trying to do, because the financial return has multiple layers to it. And the consultants and your advisors or the, your private catalytic capital, you want that total story. And it is a total story. It is an integrated financial and impact. It's a impact report.
Well, I'll just add one quick thing
Go.
onto that. They also should be integrated.
I agree.
In terms of, my impact team sits within our investment team. And we basically consult with our traditional investment team around where we think impact is actually going to be a real driver of performance or underperformance,
Absolutely.
right? And so there are so many places where they're linked. And one of the things we're observing is there's funds that we are investing in because we see in the portfolio that they're having a positive impact and that they're driving really good outcomes, and they're not reporting because they've never been asked to. And we say,
Exactly.
in order to be successful in that strategy, surely you're collecting data
Right.
on
Whatever.
number of people living in your housing unit or number of cars on the road based on what you're investing in. And so most people, in theory, should be tracking the metrics that are relevant to performance. And in a lot of cases, the metrics that are relevant to impact performance are relevant to investment performance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so
Absolutely.
it shouldn't even be that hard to report some of this stuff because the investment teams should be tracking that information for performance reasons as well.
Right.
All right, so do we have any questions in the room? One here and one there. I'll get that one, I'll get this one.
Hi, my question's for Jochebed. I'm curious about, when you were talking about the macro level, if you could just play that out a little more, maybe with the storytelling, like, can you walk me through what that would look like or some examples of how that would play out?
Yeah, I think a lot about the health of the consumer and how consumers are going to be making their decisions and spending their money, especially in the U.S., which is almost entirely consumer spending driven in terms of growth of GDP. So with climate, for example, how is that going to impact, say, any low-lying community and their ability to access insurance, to move, to build their homes? How is that going to impact the housing market in the future and where houses can actually be built? How is that going to impact the insurance market and premiums and rates and who can actually access insurance. And then I also have a very specific sort of racial equity lens and thinking about the racial wealth gap specifically and how that impacts climate and how climate also impacts inequality. So currently the median net worth in the US is declining as the demographics shift towards being a more diverse community or diverse country. And over the next 50 years, at some point, people of color are going to be the majority of the consumers in this country, and the average net worth for those people is going to be 0 or negative. So how is that going to actually impact the economy and the money that people have to spend, and which industries are going to be impacted first, and how is that going to affect how we're investing across asset classes?
Wow. Wow. Wow.
It's shocking. It's really shocking.
Awesome.
Keith Johnson, I'm with Reinhardt, a law firm that advises companies and investors in this area. I would like to hear if any of you have suggestions for questions that asset owners should ask when they're trying to identify an advisor or a manager that has the capacity to actually effectively implement or advise on implementation of sustainable investing.
So I would say from a manager perspective, background is really important. So I think, to my original point of how complicated some of these sustainability issues are, I think what worries me in this space right now, given the interest, is folks jumping in who say kind of like, we can figure this out, who don't have expertise in the actual area in sustainability issues, but are putting kind of an impact stamp on a fund because people are now interested in investing there, and that those investments play out poorly from an impact and or a financial perspective, and that kind of puts a gray cloud on what we do. So I would say it's really important to invest with experts, and that doesn't always look the same, but for a manager, I would say making sure that you're working with a manager who does actually have a background in the stuff they're investing in. It sounds really simple, but I think in this area there's a tendency, greenwashing is real, and impact stamps are working right now to get capital flowing.
Yeah. I think if you also don't have the expertise, are you willing to grow that expertise? Are you willing to shift how you think about hiring? Because these are really complex issues, and it's something that really can't be painted with a broad brush, and a lot of each individual issue needs subject matter expertise. So I don't know really anything about water, so I wouldn't be someone who would be able to advise you on that if you hired me to come and do impact investing. So thinking about how you're actually planning to augment your expertise over time.
I would add to that the relationship between the impact and the investing. So as I mentioned, we built our impact team into our investment team for very specific reasons. We wanted our impact team to be good at investing, and we wanted our investment team to understand impact characteristics. And I think one specific way to do that is to ask in front of the head of investments how they compensate their impact professionals. So that's a very targeted way to get to that outcome.
Oh, now we're getting to
find out what their priorities are. A less targeted way that would just, what's their philosophy around impact investing? Is it part of their investment thesis? Is it part of how they think about the world? Or is it an afterthought or a secondary part of their business model? And I think there's room for both of those in this ecosystem, but that should get at a very different set of criteria that you might be seeking in who's going to manage your assets.
Yeah, I would just add, the kind of questions you want to ask is about how transparent the entity or institution is about what their process is or is not. So if you're asking a consultant, you want to ask them what their process is for vetting managers. What questions are they asking? How do they evaluate the information they get back and feed it back to their clients? And if you're talking to an investment manager, what is their expertise? What is their process? Is it an afterthought, or is it integrated into their process? And how do they communicate about that back to whomever, either the consultant or to you? What is the process? Because you're trying to get a sense from that institution, consultant, manager, whatever. You're trying to get a sense for if their process passes your smell test about what you're looking for. And it could be different, right, for each asset owner here. But your process, the process has to be material. It has to ring true to you as being authentic and transparent.
So we have one more comment here for George, and then we're going to move to the next.
Hi, George Dyer with IEN. A related question, one of the barriers we often hear about is if there are enough options from ESG managers and strategies. And we know that's growing all the time, and some of it's a stamp, or some of it's growing sophistication of existing funds or new funds or funds that now have a long enough track record. And I'm just curious, like this, at this snapshot point in time, how are you feeling like that the options look, and they're growing, but are they sufficient, and is that still the barrier that it might have been a couple of years ago?
Not sufficient.
You think not sufficient?
Not enough.
But
But better.
Yeah, I would say not sufficient in the depending on how you manage assets, but we manage with active third-party managers. And we're still at a point where the number of active third-party managers across asset classes that care about impact investing, who are following through with the process and have the reporting in place and can tell us what they're doing in the way that Sasha can, is not nearly as broad as the opportunity set of all investments globally,
Yeah.
right? And so I'm not talking about the sort of broad market perception of narrowing your opportunity set. I don't care about that. I don't care if you're different from the benchmark, but actually the talent coming into impact investing is still less than the talent coming into investing broadly. But I do think we're at a tipping point. I mentioned that for 4 years we didn't do anything, and it was because we didn't think the opportunities were there, and we weren't going to bring our clients into this world without knowing we could do it. So our decision to do it reflects that it's growing, and we think it's there, but it's not where it needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, I would say not sufficient in part because the demand is outstripping the growth in the supply, and not sufficient in that there is still a need to have a certain size capital pool to really do what you want to do. And the more deeply you're moving into certain social issues or certain other things, the higher that number gets, which seems a little bit perverse to me, that the level of democratization isn't really there, right? So you have to be able to hire Sasha, right? And that's not cheap. It's not cheap. And for smaller endowments or smaller asset owners who are trying to move into this space, the opportunity set gets smaller and smaller, and I think that's problematic, just given the topic.
Yeah, I would agree. It's nice not to have competition, but as someone who cares about the issues, there are way more opportunities than we could possibly tackle, even within our pretty disciplined band of how we allocate capital, let alone across the entire capital stack.
Right.
And there's just more needed everywhere if we're really going to move the needle on the solutions we need to.
Yeah.
So I would agree.
I think this gets back to the issue asking questions, though, as well, of the process and the policies and the values, because increasingly, as these conversations become more mainstream, there are already traditional investments who don't brand themselves as impact or ESG, but who consider these things and find it important and have been doing it the entirety of their investing career. It's just not on a label.
Yeah.
So that really gets back to the importance of asking what the process is.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because we're in this funny place because all of a sudden people care about what we're doing, and they really didn't 10 years ago. Where we're kind of in this funny place where we get conversations with much larger pools of capital than would normally look at a fund our size, and they're kind of like, can you get bigger? Because we have we're trying to fit a very large bag into a much smaller
hole.
And that's like a nice problem to have for us, but it's interesting because there's the virtue of now that impact is kind of sexy, we get these conversations. But on the other hand, we're still in this impact bucket, which is somehow different from every other bucket. And the reality is I kind of want to say in a lot of these conversations, stop thinking of us as an impact
That's
fund.
right.
Just evaluate us like a fund, like you would any other fund with a specialist expertise.
That's right.
it's not actually, what we're doing is not actually different than that. But we're still in this funny place. And to your point, I think on the flip side, there are funds that could be impact.
Who
Absolutely.
are impact.
They
So
are.
will never call themselves that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I need
That's
to
right.
call time here, and this is one of those places where I told you want to keep talking, and we're going to run out of time.
We'll stop talking.
But wonderful, and we could keep going. So please thank our panelists.